Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa.
Hi, everybody. Today, we're talking to Crystal Simeoni, who is the director of NAWI Africa, which is an organization that is working to build a community of Pan-African feminists working to deconstruct and reconstruct macro-level economic policies. Previous to that, she was the economic justice lead at Feminist, which is African Women's Development and Communication Network. She has over 10 years experience working on all of these issues. And today she is joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Crystal. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Great, so we'll jump right in here. So the first question I have for you is, how would you characterize blended finance? And is it simply another form of privatization?
Yeah, so I mean, just a quick Google and you will read blended finance as a strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional finance towards sustainable development. So it's really couched in the SDGs and really couched in a development narrative. But as usual, the devil is always in the details. So once you open that up, there are little few things, like a number of things that, draw concern, especially from a Pan-African feminist perspective.
Great. So what would you say are some of the disadvantages of private forms of finance compared to public forms of finance? Because as you mentioned, the devil is in the details, and blended finance, while it can refer to many different kinds of partnerships, the overwhelming narrative is really emphasizing private forms of finance. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a number of things, and just for context, I speak from an African perspective, a Pan-African feminist perspective to be precise. And so first, when we talk about private finance and public-private partnerships, that private will most likely be global north. Very few times, if at all, will they be indigenous to the continent of Africa or anywhere in the global south, really. And that has overlaps with illicit financial flows. $100 billion leaves our continent of Africa every year through illicit financial flows, and 65% of that amount is through commercial activity. So multinationals operating in our jurisdictions. And these very multinationals are the ones that are supposedly delivering development of all kinds on this continent. So that's the first one. Secondly, there's a social contract between state and citizen, an agreement between citizens of a country or of a jurisdiction and their government of how they're governed and what's to be provided in terms of social services that are universally accessible. Now, with private finance coming in as a silver bullet and a remedy to failing public services, and the history of why public services have been failing, of course, having historical contexts around colonialism, but around privatization through the structural, the SAPs, the structural adjustment programs. And so there's a history of why our services are so weak. And once you introduce public-private partnerships, primarily private through a multinational from the global north, there's a narrative that is put forth that assumes that the African state is incapable of providing for its citizens. And so this is a very damaging one, and one that we've seen on the continent grow through the structural adjustment programs of the 80s. A lot of our, if not most of our services were privatized. And so we've got a young population, many of whom, myself included, don't really know a time where we could access universally accessible, quality, dignifying public services in the form of schools, in the form of hospitals. And so what we know is that private solutions for public problems. And so you're always trying to have enough resources to be able to access private education, private healthcare, private health insurance, have private security, private electricity backups for your houses, boreholes for water, and things like that.
Excellent. What you were saying also reminds me of the importance of an historical perspective, and especially about illicit financial flows, that when the G77 was lobbying at the ADIS conference for development finance, they wanted to close these tax havens. And of course, that didn't become part of the global agenda, right? Instead, we get blended finance and the promotion of these private instruments for all the reasons that you're citing. So I'm wondering if we can go a bit further and dig into the question of gender. So could you tell us a little bit more about the risks associated with blended finance and these private forms of financing and development more generally? You mentioned PPPs, for example, private partnerships, from a critical gendered perspective. And that is, could you please describe why you think the push for private finance is a problem for poor women or women with socioeconomic, lower on the socioeconomic scale?
Yeah, so I could speak endlessly on this, so I'll try not to, and I'll pick just a few. But really, the end goal of private sector is profit. It's not working to make sure citizens live in dignity or are joyful or have enough food on their tables. Their endpoint is profit. And so the World Bank, for example, has their cascade approach, which is really basically being shoved down our throats, which is a cascade model of, do you have a development issue? Great, all right, so there's a private solution for this problem, but are there policies and legislation that is stopping private finance from entering to be able to solve these problems? If you do, you need to change that. And once you change that, because African countries are so risky in terms of investment, you need to guarantee and de-risk private investment. And so this means in terms of what gets prioritized is not really reflective of what populations and citizens need. And so if maternal health care, for example, is not profitable, it's not on the table as a point of investment. Instead, there will be investment in mega infrastructure projects, and we're seeing this across the continent: expressways, railways, highways, all sorts of mega infrastructure that really don't have a significant impact on improving the lives of everyday people, least of all a majority of women on the continent. So, I mean, in Kenya, for example, where I live, we've built this standard gauge rail, which is accruing to about 7% of debt in terms of our GDP. That's a lot. This rail doesn't really connect like more rural communities that can access the rail to be able to transport their goods, for example. And we know that 60% of Africa's food is grown by women and smallholder farmer women. And so if it's not connecting these women who are growing the food that is feeding this population, I'm not too sure who it's made for, right? Yet, because there's a private engagement with it, it means that citizens all have to share the burden of paying for this, even if they're not using it. And so the payment of this debt will come in the forms of value-added tax and all sorts of taxation that's put on people. And we know that consumables, the taxation on consumables is borne heavily by women. And so they're bearing the burden of paying for this for years and generations to come, but it's not a service that they're able to, one, afford, and two, that's close enough for them to use. Whereas they would much more benefit from a maternal hospital, for example, or childcare services that's close to their home, so they're able to spend time working, or help and care for elderly, because those burdens are again placed on women on this continent. And so without an appreciation for what gets invested in and who decides what the priorities are, I'm afraid the women of this continent will carry the greatest burden and continue to carry the greatest burden.
So I think one of the most powerful things about your work, Crystal, is the emphasis that you put on the changes to governance that these new modes, or they're not new modes, these modes of aid modalities create. And so, for example, you've written a piece that was published in Open Democracy about public-private partnerships, and you talk about the relationship between state and citizen. And you say that it has morphed into state and private finance. So rather than talking about citizens, we're talking about financial actors more than the rest of us. So can you tell us a little bit more about the risks with this shift and what does it mean for development? You did mention the burden that women will carry in this context, but could you go a bit more into the governance question?
Yeah, so again, I'll go back to my earlier statement, which talks about, when the social contract moves away from one between state and citizen to be one between state and private finance. That is extremely dangerous. Contracts that are entered into are not subject to parliamentary discourse. Citizens have no say or no, access to understand like what these contracts are about, who this money is going to, where this money is coming from, and that's a right. That's a right that all citizens should have, especially when it's something about the development of their country with money that they're going to be having to pay for. So that in itself, I think that's the first point of concern is the role of citizens and the oversight of citizens and parliaments in being able to understand, critique, and point out areas that they don't feel comfortable with or doesn't make sense for them, that's not in line with their development trajectories. I think that's extremely important. And I don't think it happens in many other, in the global north. There's frameworks to safeguard against that. And so it's a little bit of do what we say, but don't do what we do in terms of the power divide between global north and global south. And this carries forward a power dynamic that has been in existence that is extremely extractive from the days of the slave trade, which, calculated at today's minimum wage. And this doesn't include the care work that slave women would put into the slavery time. It was about $97 trillion injected into a global north economy. This extractivism continued through colonialism, and what we're seeing now is a neo-colonialism with private finance at the center of it. It's hidden behind jargon, it's hidden behind frameworks, and sometimes seemingly complex and technical language and framing, but really at the heart of it is extraction, and it's a power dynamic, and who gets to say how things are run in a global economy. Jason Hickel describes it as an apartheid of a global economic governance system. And so I think we need to call it out for what it is. I think we also need to recognize that life happens in complexity, and our response to developmental concerns needs to happen in complexity, and we need to be able to weave in everything together. So a conversation around illicit financial flows, a conversation around reparations, a conversation now around debt and how we're going to be navigating out of COVID. And this increasing pressure to have private finance as our central pivot point to solving all our problems really needs to be all linked and underpinned in a conversation and analysis of power dynamics and really calling it for what it is. Yeah.
Fantastic. That leads us to our last question, and it reminds me of our colleagues from Dawn, which is another feminist collective of women who work on political economy, development, alternatives with women for a new era. We did an interview with them, and they talked about the corporate capture of development within the context of blended finance. And I think you're describing some of these similar dynamics. So what would you like to see in a feminist foreign aid policy? As you know, Canada is one of the countries that has announced a feminist aid policy, a feminist international assistance policy. But what are the alternatives to blended finance? You just talked about how the conversation needs to be much more complex, and these silver bullet solutions do not offer an alternative. So what would that feminist foreign aid policy look like?
That's a tough question, but a simple one at the same time. And sometimes in the middle of the discourse, it seems very complex, but really stepping back, there's a number of things that we need to push for. And that really calls for a questioning of power at the heart of everything. And that will tie to tax, will tie to debt, will tie to vaccine equity, will tie to climate change, all of it. So one, I think, for a global North economy, there's a call for a degrowth agenda. And this is really questioning and pulling back on this idea of this obsession with growth and what that means. And trying to push for a degrowth agenda means slowly coming to a point where we're finding a healthier balance between the planet and people. And this has a range of things, and there's lots that's been written about it in terms of, cutting back down to a 4-day working week, looking at fast fashion, for example, looking at this obsession with growth and measured by GDP, which doesn't really measure everything. So that for the global north. For regions like Africa, where I come from, knowing that we still need to grow, but questioning what sort of growth do we need, I think we're calling for a post-growth agenda, which centers citizen well-being and the planet's well-being at the center of all decisions and all developmental trajectory. Once that is put as a lens before which you look at the world and look at development finance, I think most other things will drastically change. I think working towards, a situation where lives can be seen as the end point, being able for people to be able to live in dignity and have joyful lives and fulfilling lives. I think that begins to change the narrative rather than measuring things by, just market exchanges as GDP measures it. I think that's very important. I think decolonizing spaces and processes. So I really question, and this is a bit radical, but the role of the IMF and the role of the World Bank and the role of the OECD. I know we're pushing for a global tax body to sit in the United Nations because we're not represented at the OECD, yet the rules and frames that they decide around tax specifically are rules and frameworks that we have to abide by, which is really unfair and again, are extractive at their core. And so having a global tax policy at the United Nations, but with a caveat to recognize that there's power dynamics even within the United Nations, and really beginning to work around what that actually means is very important. We need to talk about reparations too, and stop hiding that under carpets. As I said, there's trillions of dollars injected into a global North economy through the slavery time. The colonial period was another extractive era. And again, now with private finance, with things like blended finance, public-private partnerships, financialization, basically. It's financializing everyday life of especially global South citizens at their expense, yet the rest of the world seems to be moving on and destroying the planet, and its impact is where we're feeling the largest parts of their impact as well. So really moving away from me for a feminist foreign policy, away from this obsession of GDP growth, is the beginning and the root of a lot of things. Decolonizing our narratives and making sure there's space for multiple voices and a diversity of voices and pluralism of ideas, and knowing that this neoliberal capitalist framing is not the only alternative. There are alternatives, and there's the feminist movement, Dawn, who you mentioned. I mean, I was reading a book a few months ago by Dawn from 1985, and to be honest, it sounded like they were writing it in 2021. Everything that they were saying is exactly the same things that we're saying. And so recognizing that there are alternatives that have been documented, that have been come up, and but we need to recognize that they're there and begin to seriously look at alternatives to the current framing of a global economy.
Yes, this conversation reminds me of the debates that we've had in Canada about the problems of tide aid. And in fact, blended finance could be seen as a form of tide aid, because we're basically saying, if you want to use this public money, this ODA money, we're going to leverage it. We're going to tie it to a whole bunch of other set of incentives. So in a way, we're hiding what we've fought against for the last 20, 30 years. My goodness. Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll have one more question about the Equality Fund. The Canadian government has committed $300 million to this pooled blended finance initiative, which aims to empower women. What would you say about that model of financing for development? What kind of feminism is that, and what do you think they could do instead?
I may not be able to speak to what kind of feminism that is, because I'm not so sure how feminist that is. But I wish they would instead put their efforts into making sure that women's movements and feminist movements across the world are properly financed and resourced as movements with core funding rather than project funding. I think financing movements and movement building is core and central to the change that we're going to see. I think the change that we're going to see cannot come from, private sector in that sense. They're allies and they can be allies, but the more I'm in multilateral spaces and spaces of power, the more I see the presence of private sector, and not just the presence, but more power and control that they have in these spaces. And that's extremely worrying for me. So I think it's the financing of movements and feminist movement building directly to the global south, rather than, directed through bigger, global north-based organizations. I think the time for that has come to change. And I think what they need to be doing is checking power and recognizing their own power in systems and pushing for equality in a global economic governance system that is so unequal and so extractive. So pushing for a tax body at the UN, for example, is something very low-hanging fruit. Pushing for a TRIPS waiver is a very low-hanging fruit. I think a shift in narrative from, focusing on individual livelihoods to systemic change is something that they need to take on board. And doing that needs a little bit of a shift in terms of their strategy for this really huge amount of money.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.